Hi, I'm Jane Farnham from Great British Talent, and welcome to our series of video podcasts where we meet our talented speakers who are available for your corporate events. So it's an opportunity for you to find out more about our wonderful speakers and what they talk about and how they can help to add value to your next event. So today, let me introduce our next speaker. It is psychotherapist and mental health speaker, Owen O'Kane. Owen, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
No problem, Jane. Nice to meet you, and nice to do this. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, no, it's really great. I love finding out about our speakers because you're all such a talented, wonderful, tenacious bunch that I know that can help our clients with their events. So it's really good opportunity to find out more about you. So before we delve deeper into the actual speaking and the corporate world, tell me about your life prior to speaking and how you found yourself here.
By accident. Is the honest answer. Yeah, I mean, so my background was split between health and psychology. So I started off my career, worked in accident and emergency, then I was a palliative care specialist, and then retrained as a psychotherapist many years ago. Just kind of my career went off in a different direction, did all the normal career stuff, and then kind of climbed the ladder a bit, was a clinical lead for mental health in London. Did that job, and then this rare opportunity came where I got the opportunity to write a book, which was incredible, but it wasn't part of a plan, just happened. Published that book about 5 years ago. It exploded, did incredibly well. Off the back of that, I've written another 2 books, and that then just kind of evolved. I guess really the books are one way of using a platform, and then off the back of it, I started getting invited to do a lot of talks and workshops, and started to do a lot more talks. So it almost evolved accidentally, but then I suddenly realized it's a brilliant platform to reach people. You know, I get to do my job in a very different way, but I get to reach a lot of people. So, I mean, to be honest, it genuinely is it's kind of one of the favorite parts of my job, to be honest. I love the talks.
Oh, brilliant. So talking about then your expertise around psychotherapy, how has your background shaped that?
I mean, for me, it's probably a bit different to some other speakers. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of over pathologizing people. I'm not a big fan of kind of labeling and stuff. I think the human condition is we struggle. Every human being will struggle. That could be anxiety, it could be stress, it could be low mood, it could be lack of motivation, it could be lack of direction. I think the human condition is sometimes to struggle. But I guess really what I try to do unapologetically is I use all of my experience really. So I obviously use my psychology training and my mental health experience, but I also kind of incorporate my experience of what did working with the dying for 10 years teach me about what makes a better life. And I guess my own backstory wasn't exactly the easiest story. I grew up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, which is, you know, it was a lot of trauma and a lot of anxiety during that period. So I kind of use my own experience to inform how I do my work. So I guess really it's a very human view on the human condition. But I really believe there's no point in bringing the problems to people. I believe you also have to bring solutions in the way forward. So I guess my events and my talks, they're not heavy, they're not negative, they're not pathology driven. They're ultimately about, it's okay that you're having a tough time, but I think helping people make sense of why they're having a tough time so they can unravel is important. But for me, the big focus and the big energy is about kind of freeing people up and moving them forward. That's kind of the impetus and the energy behind my talks.
Yeah, I always think it's a baby step approach and just it's like the layers of an onion. It's kind of unraveling them to get to the root issues. And also you meet people, don't you, in life who sort of say, you offer them a solution approach, and then they've got a problem for every solution. And you're just like, I've had this conversation with my kids, and you just kind of go, okay, so you're just getting in your own way here and offering people opportunities to kind of see beyond that and how they can flip it on its head.
Yeah, and I think it's that, and I think it's also about, I mean, every talk I do, I think one of the key things for me is the way people talk to themselves and the way they treat themselves. You know, I say all of the time, most people wouldn't talk to another person the way they talk to themselves. So a lot of people have these kind of internal critical voices, and most people do really beat themselves up. So I guess what I've learned over the years is you can teach people every technique in the book, but if they continue with that kind of internal self-sabotaging, then the techniques are meaningless.
Yeah.
So a big thing for me is really helping people get on board with the fact, you really need to stop beating yourself up. You need to go easier. And, in psychology speak, it's about activating that kind of self-compassion, self-understanding, and getting to know, like we're like a machine, really, aren't we? And very often we crash land into adulthood and we don't understand why we think the way we do. We don't understand why these big emotions come up. We don't understand why we behave the way we do, either in work or in our personal lives. So I guess the experience I have, it gives me license in some ways to show people, okay, here's why this might be happening. Here's what you can do about this here. But more importantly, do treat yourself as somebody who matters along the way, because I think if you get that right, you're halfway there.
Yeah. Look
And
after yourself. Put your own life jacket on first, eh?
yeah, no, and I know it sounds like a real cliche, but most people don't get it. Most people I see in therapy come in and, like you listen to the way they're treating themselves on top of an already difficult time. So I guess even within the workplace and corporate organizations, a lot of people, they are overwhelmed, they're burnt out, they're exhausted, they might have a degree of imposter syndrome. I mean, so much of this is, you could argue some of it is what goes on in the world, but the conversations we don't have is where people get in their own way,
Yeah,
you know,
absolutely.
and that
So
is a big thing for me.
yeah, I understand that from a one-on-one approach, and I think of I've done my therapy, and I absolutely value it so much. I think it's really important. I find it really cathartic to talk. So that's a personal journey, but I suppose then moving into the corporate world. What are the common challenges? I mean, you've just mentioned a few there: burnout, anxiety. How can they be addressed, and how can you offer solutions in a group setting
Yeah, I
that
mean,
helps the business move
I mean,
forward?
it's a really good part. I mean, unapologetically for me, it always starts with the individual, because it's the individual that comes into your workplace. So it's the individual self that's within a workplace, and then obviously cultures develop. And I guess the sort of things that I see come up over and over again are around, how do you manage overwhelm? How do you manage burning out? How do you manage people who are just overactive and they just can't slow down? But within that, there, you also get a lot of difficulty with adjusting to change. I mean, organizations often have to move forward and they have to be innovative and they have to go where the demand is. And I think sometimes employees struggle with that when the organization's moving in one direction, they're playing catch up. So a big part of my work is helping organizations during periods of difficulties. How do they make that adjustment? And a key concept within that is, I often talk about, I'm not a huge believer in positive thinking for the sake of positive thinking. I think there are times it doesn't work effectively. Whereas what I'm interested in is psychological flexibility. So within corporate organizations, I think if you teach individuals and teams how to think in a way that's psychologically flexible, they're open, they're more curious about what's happening, they're more adaptable, they can hear each other, they create cultures that are interactive rather than just dictatorial. I mean, they're the cultures that I see grow and expand very, very well. And then within all of that, they're just to create an openness around the fact that because you're dealing with human beings, that does mean there is often going to be a degree of interaction, needing to understand the other, ability to listen to the other. So I guess it's multifaceted, and I will tailor a talk to the individual's needs. I mean, I can go to one organization and they might have something enormous going on, like they're going through a merger and the team are really struggling with that. So it makes sense for me to focus on where the team are at a given time, rather than me go in assuming what the issues are. So I'll always listen really carefully to the brief on what they want, what the landscape is like within the organization at that given time, and what I can give that's going to be of as much value as possible. I think there's a culture at the minute where employers get blamed on employee mental well-being, and I really think it's an unhealthy narrative that we need to move away from. That employers have a responsibility, but also employees have a responsibility. So, and I think that conversation needs to be opened up more. And so it's
I agree. I think day to day, you meet people who do not take responsibility for their
yeah,
behaviour, their actions. It's about accountability. It's about stepping up and owning stuff.
yeah.
I teach my kids that every day. It's like, yeah, you messed up. We all mess up.
Yeah, but we
Move on, learn, grow. And that's how we grow as human beings. Is
We
taking that.
we all do. I talk about every talk I give. I sort of give them a crash course in psychology, and we're all driven by three mechanisms as human beings, and they are threat, drive, and soothe. So I won't bore you with the details too much, but threat is basically that anxiety mechanism within us, which creates a sense of being on guard or being on vigilant. Drive is about being more, doing more, getting more, achieving, succeeding. So most human beings have got highly elevated threat and drive systems, which in themselves can create problems when they're overramped. Whereas actually most human beings, when it comes to their own kind of soothing mechanisms, and we need that to kind of regulate the other two, most people genuinely don't know how to use that and to activate that within themselves or within their teams. So for me, that's also a really important thing too, is that, you really do need to understand the mechanics of how you operate, and you need to understand the mechanics of how teams operate. And if the balance isn't right between the three, then you're going to get dysfunction and you're going to get chaos and problems. So it feels almost like, I think these talks for me have to be about helping teams recognize where the challenges might be, but more importantly, how do they get back to that point of stability, and how do they create steadier platforms? Because I guess ultimately, I did stuff with Theo Paphitis from Dragon's Den a couple of years ago at his, he does an event every year for small businesses, and I did a talk for them last year in Birmingham. And I talked about healthy mind, healthy business. And it's one thing that people don't think about, that to have a successful, flourishing business, what you need is you need an organization with people who are operating from healthy mindsets. And by that I mean, I think it's about helping people create steady platforms internally. So that whatever the external stuff, the pressures, the deadlines, the targets, the appraisals, all of the stuff that people are up against, if people generally have internal steadier platforms, then they cope much better with the external stuff.
But let's face it, we're all creatures of habit, aren't we? Don't like change very much.
Oh, no, we don't.
We really fight it, don't we?
I know.
And this, the best business have to go through change, and quite quickly, and that's what small business particularly are great for this, because you are a small business, you are more fluid and adaptable, and you can change really quickly, and you need the staff to be on board with that level of change. So in terms of practical strategies, what can people do just in their daily lives to be more balanced and have that go with the flow mentality, as opposed to become very
I mean, it's an enormous question, but if I were to break it down into kind of bullet point what works best, I mean, I think if you look at why we struggle as people, most people's key struggles are linked to the way they think, how they handle their emotions, the way they behave in their life. They're for most people the key kind of components of human struggle. And I guess what you identify with most people is they have some people go into very negative, critical mindsets. I mean, we've got about 80,000 thoughts a day, which is a lot of thoughts. And about 70% of those are negative in nature. So I guess you're teaching people how to adopt mindsets that are more practical, more adaptive, hard to deal with the negative thoughts. You're helping them deal with when the big emotions come up, like overwhelm and burnout and exhaustion. They're actually good things. They feel horrible, but actually they're an indicator. So how can you listen to the indicators, and how do you work with them? How do you create boundaries in your life? What are the behaviors that are serving you well? So most people, when they're going through a tough time, will list a whole list of behaviors that are working for them, and they'll list a whole list of behaviors that are working against them. So I kind of focus on, okay, well, what does psychology and neuroscience tell us it works? What do we know helps? So we know, like, the simple things like the food you put in your body. Inflammatory foods cause a state of inflammation, not only in the gut, but in the brain. If you're anxious and you've got an inflamed brain, you're going to be more anxious. So the basics of nutrition, exercise, boundaries, who you surround yourself with, I guess doing something that matters as well. There's been a load of research on, doing work that matters to you. And finding purpose in everything that you do, all the research around that. And I guess as well, there was a big piece of research done about, I think it took about 12 years to correlate. And an American researcher looked at who are the happiest people, what makes people happy. And what they discovered was people who were on board with their own struggle, people who could be vulnerable, people who weren't frightened to share that they were having a tough time, people who were quite honest about who they are. They were the happiest people. And I guess, the psychologist Jung talked about the shadow. We all have this dark side. And he talked about the kind of the pretense and the mask that we all wear some of the time. So I guess really these talks as well are about helping people and organizations drop the mask and become more real, and become more open, and become, I guess, just more curious and open, because I think often organizations can operate from a model of this is what we've done. This is what we've always done. This is what we will always do. And actually, if there's no flexibility in that, then you're always going to have resistance. So I guess really part of my job, I think, is to come in the most helpful way possible and to disrupt and to create new ways of thinking and to create new energy and to, these talks are always hopeful and optimistic in the best possible way. It's about actually, no, the more you can break down the resistance, the more you can move forward.
It's almost allowing people to be themselves and their authentic selves. And I think people are so afraid of being their authentic selves because, your inner voice from you not to do this and not to be that and do it. And you're talking to yourself, as you said, in these bad, negative ways. And you need to kind of flip that. But for me, it's about having the confidence to be authentically you. And I think that helps in the workplace because everybody then knows where they stand. And we all have our vulnerabilities and we all have negatives and we all have our weak points. But it's about, if using those, if I've got a weak point somewhere, then somebody else may have strength there. And it's about them working together to bring the best for the company. But I know that in your TEDx talk, you talk about turning adversity into power. So how would a corporation do that? Give us some how would you, if you were going in, well, I suppose, this is why briefing calls are so valuable. So I'm not sure if any clients out there who are potentially looking for speakers, just so that you know that whenever you do book a speaker, you will have a full briefing call so that you can discuss your requirements. And the issues that you're facing and what's happening in the business, and then someone like Owen can come in and obviously create really bespoke content. But adversity into power.
For those that haven't seen the TED Talk, it was an odd TED Talk to do because I have a piano on stage with me, and pardon me, I've got a frog in my throat. Let me clear up.
Have a glass of water.
Sorry about that. I've had a cold the last couple of days, so I'm doing loads of speaking events today, so I'm running out of energy in my throat. So in my TED Talk, I learned to play piano growing up. And the piano became like an odd way of me. I didn't realize it at the time, but it used to really calm my mind down. And so when I did this TED Talk, I was talking about music basically, and it might sound a bit of an odd thing, but often in music, for example, you got major chords and minor chords, and you can have subtle shifts in music. And like a minor chord, for example, can sound negative, but actually sometimes you need a major chord to transition into a minor chord, and the minor chords help you transition into a major chord. So basically the whole premise of the TED Talk is that in music teaches us that sometimes a really small adjustment can change how a chord can sound. It can change the whole landscape of the piece of music. And I guess when I'm working with organizations, what I help them see as well is that people often look for big solutions. They think they need to overhaul the entire organization. They need to get a massive mental health strategy in place. They need to get this in. They need to get that in. And actually, it's often smaller tweaks and adjustments that can be really powerful. And I think as well is that if an organization identify that they've got problems and they've got issues, I never see that as a negative. I see that as an opportunity to think, okay, well, look, this again is an indicator, it's a signpost for how you can perhaps use the challenge, the difficulty to transition and build something stronger and more powerful. Because I think challenges and difficulties and setbacks, they have to be part of every story, whether it's an individual story or an organizational story. And I think people can, when I did that talk for the business institute that Theo was running, what I was talking about there is most people, kind of fall at the first hurdle because they think, oh, I'm not good enough, or I failed, or I'm rubbish. It's again going back to this kind of internal monitor, where actually, if you can develop the kind of resilience and strength to build on the setbacks and the knockbacks and not see them as a negative or a failure, but actually an essential part of the process. So the entire workforce then becomes about learning and opportunity and growth and building, rather than seeing them as negatives and setbacks. And like unquestionably, every piece of research in occupational psychology will say there's always so much to be learned from these difficult moments. So, if I'm with an organization and they say, okay, we've got these 3 problems at the minute, I'll say, okay, well, we'll kind of deconstruct them and we'll look at them, but rather than see them and keep them labeled and defined as a problem, why don't we look at them as an opportunity to build and to grow and to see what they can teach. And, I think that's an incredible way to work, because it's not kind of psychobabble. It's not burying your head in the sand. It's not pretending there isn't a problem.
Real.
It's going to the problem and it's identifying that it's there, but it's also making the decision that I'm not going to be stuck with the problem and I'm not going to stay here. So the options for most people are, when they're struggling, is either to get stuck, to kind of give up and not try, or to make a decision, okay, I'm willing to grow from this. So I guess really that's what my TED talk was about, is the opportunity to, when you've got imperfection and when you've got a situation that's less than ideal, okay, well, how can I use this to move through and to grow? So I think it would be foolish not to include it in my work.
Is there one engagement that really stands out for you, where you've made a real impact, or someone's come up to you afterwards and you've seen a shift?
Probably the immediate one that comes to mind is, I did a gig about a year ago, and it was for the motor industry. Now I'm going to be really honest about this. It was 500 men. So this gig was for five. It was a live event. It was up kind of beyond Birmingham somewhere. And on the brief call, it was the first time they'd done a mental health gig. So when I say mostly men, 95% of the workforce, because of the nature of the work, there's a lot of mechanics, they were out on the road. 95% were male, and there were some female staff, but they were mostly admin. They had never done a mental health talk before. They had warned me on the briefing call that they might be resistant. It was a live event as well. They might be a bit resistant. They might be a bit cynical about somebody coming in. They hear the word psychotherapist, they're expecting some, they have a stereotypical. And I went and did this gig, and if I'm being really honest about it, I was a bit nervous going to the gig, because when the briefing tells you this is going to be a tough audience, you sort of go in ready for a tough audience. Now, I should be honest about this. Before I went on, there was an American guy doing a speech, and he was basically brought over to tell them how America were doing it better than they were in the UK.
Oh, cool.
So actually, well, it was helpful for me, because in short, he had really pissed off the audience. And it was a very, very American presentation, and it was very, very high energy, and you got this, and a lot of graphs. This is what you do. This is what we do. And a lot of comparisons. I don't use graphs. I don't use slides, because I think this should never be a lecture. It should be a dialogue. It should be a conversation. Anyway, I get on in these 500 blokes who are all sat there, poker faced, really annoyed with the last speaker, to be quite honest, because he was telling them that they were crap compared to America. And I went on, and I deliberately took a very, very human approach to what it is to struggle. And I started off by saying, I just want to kick off. Has anyone in the room ever had a day where they just felt exhausted? Has anyone ever woke up some days just thinking, I can't be arsed, I just can't be bothered today? Has anyone had moments when they feel demotivated? Has anyone had moments where they know they're really agitated and they're irritable with their partner? So I went through a whole list of everyday life stuff.
Yeah.
They will all identify with. And of course, they were raising their hand to everything. And I said, well, this is mental health. This is a conversation. This is the humanity of story here. So anyway, I get into the talk with these guys, and it was incredible, actually. And I deliberately stayed with the kind of the humanity of struggle, rather than over pathologize or lecture or get too heavy on data. And within about 15 minutes, they were really starting to interact. And the long and the short of this story is, at the end of every talk, particularly live events, people will ask a lot of questions. And you normally have a line of people wanting to ask you questions. Of all of the events I've done in my career, this was the longest line. So we were in this huge auditorium. Wow. And when I finished, there was a line from the stage to the end of the auditorium.
Okay.
And the first guy who came up to me, there were a few people around him, and he said, oh, thank you so much. That really touched me. And he said, I wish my son had heard this talk a few years ago. And I said, and then he just paused and he said, my son took his life. So his son was 19-year-old and his son has taken his life. Now, his colleagues around him were incredibly supportive, and he was totally on board with the content, as were some of his team members. But that was the first interaction I had. And then it was just story after story. I mean, honestly, I think I left that gig about an hour and a half later, because it was just sheer need. Now, the reason I share that story was the organisation themselves thought they were taking a risk bringing me in to do this talk, because they didn't think it was going to be for the guys. They thought they would be cynical about it, and they primed me for, this is going to be a tough gig. And actually, it was the opposite. It was probably one of the most fulfilling gigs in my career, because this was an audience that you wouldn't expect to want to hear this information. And I guess the whole remit of my work in using these platforms is to reach people who ordinarily wouldn't seek help. I mean, that is the whole ethos of my, that's the goal of my work, if I'm being honest. Everything I do, either it's writing books, delivering talks, doing TV or radio stuff, the ethos of my work is to reach people who ordinarily wouldn't seek help. And I guess that talk for me was indicative of the need and hunger for content, but content that people can relate to.
Yeah, and I think it's very indicative of a male audience, isn't it? Like men are brought up differently to women, to be stoic and to be strong and to not show your emotions, and to be, I think the world is changing whereby we appreciate that men have those same emotions and struggles and adversities. So I'm so glad that you were able to share your day with them, because some of those men may never have heard that message otherwise, and know that it's okay to wake up feeling like crap and feeling ratty and, awful. And it's really important to know that we're all human. We're all just human.
I think too, and I think there is a bit. I think people are a bit worn out at the minute. I mean, there is a lot of top line pop psychology out there with, you got this, and just tell you, look at yourself in the mirror and tell yourself you're beautiful. I mean, I'm not being cynical about that stuff. I know it works for some people, but in the world I live in, and in the real world, people need more than platitudes. I think they need to understand. I think people genuinely are okay once they understand what's happening for them and why it might be happening. They're okay. But I think when you just give platitudes to people or cliches, they tend to shut down very, very quickly. So I do deliberately and consciously avoid that approach, because I don't think it's helpful, but I don't think it helps you deliver your message.
I think that's lovely. I'm really so glad that you're with us at Great British Speakers.
No, I'm glad you have me.
No, I just think it's ace. I mean, I love anything that's positive, and this is, it's addressing negatives to turn them on their head. But it is much deeper than just sort of going into a business and saying you need to do this. It is about thinking and taking accountability. But if you would like to book Owen, speak at your next event, and create a flexible thinking workforce, then just call us or email jane@greatbritishtalent.com, or you can call 01753 439 289. And Owen, can I just say once again, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Likewise. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you.